Picture this. It's February 24th, 2022. You're sitting at your desk scrolling through the news as the world watches Russian tanks roll into Ukraine. Within hours, Western leaders appear on every screen, their faces grave but determined. The message is clear and unified. Russia will pay an economic price so severe, so devastating, that Putin will have no choice but to retreat. The ruble will collapse, the banks will crumble, the Russian people will rise up. It will all be over in weeks, maybe months. Now, fast forward to today, January 31st, 2026. Nearly 4 years have passed. And here's what nobody wants to talk about. Russia's economy hasn't collapsed. In fact, by several measures, it's doing things that shouldn't be possible. The ruble stabilized, trade continued, oil kept flowing, and the sanctions, those unprecedented, coordinated, supposedly ironclad sanctions, didn't work the way anyone promised they would. So what happened? Why did the economic weapon that was supposed to end this conflict seem to backfire? And what does this mean for the future of global power, for your own economy, for the way wars will be fought in the decades ahead? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We've been told a story about sanctions, about economic dominance, about the power of the Western financial system. And that story is cracking apart. What you're about to discover isn't just about Russia. It's about the hidden fragility of the entire global economic order we've lived under for 70 years. Let me take you back to March 2nd, 2022. Janet Yellen, the US Treasury Secretary, stands before cameras and announces what she calls the economic equivalent of shock and awe. The European Union, the United States, Canada, Japan, and other allies have just unleashed the most comprehensive sanctions package in modern history. They've frozen roughly $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. They've cut major Russian banks from SWIFT, the global financial messaging system that makes international banking possible. They've banned imports of Russian oil, gas, and coal. They've prohibited exports of advanced technology to Russia. They've targeted over 1,000 Russian individuals and entities with asset freezes and travel bans. The announcement sends shockwaves through Moscow. Within days, the ruble crashes, losing nearly 40% of its value. Russians line up at ATMs, are desperate to withdraw cash. International brands, McDonald's, Starbucks, Apple, IKEA, announce they're suspending operations. The Moscow Stock Exchange stays closed for weeks. Western economists appear on television predicting Russia's GDP will crater by 15% or more. Former US Treasury officials call it financial nuclear war. The consensus is universal. Russia's economy is about to implode. But something strange starts happening around April of 2022. The ruble, which had plummeted to over 150 per dollar, begins climbing back. By June, it's actually stronger than it was before the invasion. Russian oil, supposedly cut off from global markets, keeps finding buyers. India and China increase their purchases dramatically, and they're not buying at massive discounts. They're paying close to market rates. Turkey becomes a major transit hub for Russian goods, suddenly labelled as Turkish exports. Ships turn off their tracking systems in the Black Sea, reappear weeks later in Asian ports with holds full of Russian oil. The architects of these sanctions had made a fundamental miscalculation, one that reveals a dangerous blind spot in Western strategic thinking. They had assumed that economic interdependence worked in only one direction, that Russia needed the West more than the West needed Russia. They had assumed that the rest of the world would automatically fall in line with Western sanctions. And they had assumed that Russia hadn't been preparing for this exact scenario for nearly a decade. Here's what they missed. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and faced the first round of Western sanctions, Putin launched what he called economic fortification. His government quietly built alternative payment systems, diversified its foreign reserves away from dollars and euros, stockpiled currencies from countries unlikely to impose sanctions, strengthened trade relationships with non-Western partners, and created redundancies in critical supply chains. By the time February 2022 arrived, Russia had reduced its dollar-denominated reserves from nearly 50% in 2014 to around 16%. It had built up the world's fourth largest gold reserves. It had created SPFS, its own alternative to SWIFT, which now connects over 400 banks across 20 countries. It had established yuan-ruble currency swaps with China worth billions. It had positioned itself as the world's largest wheat exporter, giving it leverage with food-importing nations in Africa and the Middle East. None of this was secret. Russian officials had spoken openly about de-dollarization and economic sovereignty for years, but Western policymakers had dismissed it as posturing, as economically irrational. After all, why would any country voluntarily reduce its access to the most liquid, most trusted financial system in history? Now we know the answer, because that system can be weaponized against you. Let me show you how the sanctions actually played out versus how they were supposed to work. The Western economic playbook was based on a simple theory. Step 1. Cut Russia off from international financial systems. Step 2. This prevents Russia from conducting trade. Step 3. Without trade, Russia can't earn revenue or import necessary goods. Step 4. The economy collapses, public discontent rises, and Putin faces either removal or capitulation. But here's what actually happened. When Russian banks were cut from SWIFT, Russia redirected payments through its SPFS system, through Chinese CIPS system, through cryptocurrency channels, through old-fashioned correspondent banking relationships in neutral countries. When Western nations banned Russian oil, Russia rerouted shipments to Asia and the Middle East. India's imports of Russian crude went from nearly zero before the war to over 1.6 million barrels per day by late 2023. China's purchases increased by over 50%. And here's the kicker. Those oil sales generated almost as much revenue as before, because global oil prices spiked due to the very sanctions meant to punish Russia. In 2022, despite losing the European market, Russia's oil and gas revenues actually increased compared to 2021. The sanctions had created the exact market conditions that benefited the target they were meant to destroy. When Western companies pulled out of Russia, it created a vacuum that domestic producers rushed to fill. Restaurants that once served McDonald's burgers reopened as Vkusno I Tochka, tasty and that's it, serving nearly identical food. Cars that were once Renaults became Moskvich again. Technology gaps were filled by Chinese alternatives. Huawei instead of Apple, Yandex instead of Google. Yes, the quality often dropped. Yes, Russians lost access to many products and services. But the economic collapse everyone predicted? It didn't materialize. Russia's GDP did contract in 2022, but only by about 2.1%, nowhere near the 15% forecasted. By 2023 it was growing again, with official figures showing 3.6% growth, driven by massive government spending on military production and infrastructure. Unemployment remained below 4% throughout. Inflation spiked, but was brought under control faster than in many Western countries. You might be thinking, those numbers are propaganda. Russia is lying about its economic data. And you're not entirely wrong to be skeptical. But here's the thing. Multiple independent analysts, including those hostile to Putin's regime, have verified that while Russia certainly massages its statistics, the overall picture of economic resilience is fundamentally accurate. The lights stayed on, salaries got paid, grocery stores remained stocked. The banking system functioned. How? Let me introduce you to a concept that explains not just Russia's survival, but the future of global economics, the parallel economy. While the West was congratulating itself on unprecedented economic coordination, it failed to notice that a significant portion of the world wasn't joining in. China, with the world's second-largest economy, didn't impose sanctions. India, the world's most populous nation, didn't impose sanctions. Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico, representing billions of people and trillions in GDP, didn't impose sanctions. These weren't isolated holdouts. They represented an alternative economic sphere that had been quietly growing for years. This parallel economy operates through different financial rails, different trade routes, different reserve currencies. When Russia was cut from dollar and euro systems, it simply shifted more trade into yuan, rupees, and even direct barter arrangements. When Western ports closed to Russian ships, Chinese and Turkish ports opened wider. When Western technology was banned, Chinese semiconductors and machinery filled the gaps. The sanctions revealed something Western policymakers hadn't fully grasped. The US dollar's dominance, while still overwhelming, had already begun a slow decline. Between 2000 and 2022, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves dropped from 71% to about 59%. Not a collapse, but a steady erosion. And every time the US weaponizes dollar access, freezing assets, blocking transactions, threatening secondary sanctions, it gives other nations an incentive to accelerate their search for alternatives. Think about it from their perspective. If you're a leader in Indonesia or Brazil or Kenya, you watch the US freeze $300 billion of Russian reserves overnight. Those weren't assets in Russian territory. Those were reserves Russia had accumulated through legitimate trade, held in Western banks specifically because they were supposed to be safe. The sanctity of central bank reserves had been a bedrock principle of the international financial system, and it vanished in a weekend. What message does that send? It tells every non-Western nation, your reserves aren't safe if you ever find yourself on the wrong side of Washington's foreign policy. It doesn't matter if you followed every rule, every regulation. Political decisions can override property rights, and if it can happen to Russia, it can happen to you. This is driving the most significant realignment of global economic architecture since the end of World War II. China and Brazil now settle bilateral trade in their own currencies, bypassing dollars entirely. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, representing over 40% of global population and more than a quarter of global GDP. They're actively developing alternative payment systems, discussing a common currency, and building trade relationships that deliberately exclude Western financial infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, America's longtime partner in the petrodollar system, is now selling oil to China in yuan and accepting yuan for other trade. The United Arab Emirates has set up yuan clearinghouses. Even France has completed transactions in yuan. These aren't hostile acts aimed at destroying American power. They're rational hedges against a financial system that has proven itself unreliable and politically volatile. The shift is happening in boardrooms and central banks around the world. In Singapore, financial institutions are establishing dual currency trading platforms to accommodate both Western and Eastern payment systems. In Dubai, new financial zones are being created specifically to facilitate trade that bypasses traditional Western banking channels. In Latin America, discussions about regional payment systems have accelerated from theoretical conversations to concrete planning sessions with timelines and budgets. This isn't just about currency transactions. It's about the entire infrastructure of global commerce being duplicated, creating parallel systems that reduce dependencies. New shipping routes are being established. New insurance mechanisms are being developed. New commodity exchanges are opening in Shanghai and Mumbai to compete with London and New York. The monopoly on setting global prices for everything from oil to copper to wheat is being challenged. Now let's talk about the backfire, the ways these sanctions actually hurt the countries that imposed them more than they hurt Russia. Europe, which had become heavily dependent on cheap Russian natural gas, suddenly faced energy prices that quadrupled almost overnight. German factories, the industrial engine of Europe, started shutting down because they couldn't afford to operate. Household heating bills in the UK skyrocketed, pushing millions into fuel poverty. European governments had to spend hundreds of billions in subsidies to prevent complete economic collapse, money that came from taxpayers and will burden them for decades. Meanwhile, Russia redirected its gas to China through new pipelines and existing routes. It sold oil to India at modest discounts, which India then refined and sold to Europe at premium prices. The net result: Europe paid more for energy, Russia earned nearly as much as before, and China and India profited from arbitrage. The sanctions had created a more expensive, less efficient system that hurt European consumers and businesses while barely denting Russian revenues. Global food prices spiked because Russia and Ukraine together account for nearly 30% of global wheat exports and significant percentages of fertilizer and other agricultural commodities. African nations face bread shortages and inflation. The World Food Programme warned of famines. And while Western nations blamed Russia for weaponizing food, many developing countries saw it differently. They saw sanctions disrupting the global food system, and Western nations refusing to create humanitarian exemptions. The inflation spike that hit Western economies in 2022 and 2023 had multiple causes, but energy and food price increases driven by sanctions-related disruptions were significant contributors. Now, central banks had to raise interest rates aggressively, slowing growth and increasing borrowing costs. Mortgages became less affordable. Businesses cut investment. The economic pain was real and widespread, and it happened in countries that imposed sanctions, not just in Russia. Perhaps most significantly, the sanctions accelerated the very trend they were meant to prevent, the decline of Western economic hegemony. Every nation that watched this unfold learned a lesson about the risks of dependence on Western systems. Every finance minister who saw frozen reserves started diversifying. Every trade negotiator who witnessed secondary sanctions started seeking alternatives. The weaponization of interdependence has made interdependence itself seem dangerous. And the alternative that's emerging isn't a world where the West maintains its dominance. It's a fragmented world with competing systems, higher transaction costs, less efficient resource allocation, and more opportunities for conflict. Does this mean Russia emerged unscathed? Absolutely not. The sanctions imposed real costs. Russian living standards declined. Access to advanced technology became severely constrained, which will hurt long-term innovation and growth. Capital flight intensified. Over 1 million Russians, many of them young and educated, left the country. The brain drain will have consequences for decades. The reorientation of trade toward Asia came with infrastructure costs and less favorable terms than European trade had offered. Russian tech companies that once collaborated with Western partners found themselves isolated from cutting-edge research and development. The loss of access to advanced semiconductors means Russian industries, from automotive to aerospace, are working with technology that's generations behind. This technological gap will compound over time, making Russian products less competitive globally and limiting the country's ability to innovate in critical sectors like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing. The pharmaceutical and medical equipment sectors took particularly hard hits. Russian hospitals struggled to maintain sophisticated medical equipment without access to Western replacement parts and technical support. Patients requiring specialized treatments faced delays and complications. While Russia has worked to develop domestic alternatives and source equipment from China and India, the quality gap remains significant in many areas. But here's the critical distinction. Russia survived and adapted while the sanctions failed to achieve their primary objective, changing Russian behavior or crippling its ability to wage war. If anything, the militarization of the economy and the rally around the flag effect strengthened Putin's domestic position in the short term. The sanctions turned into what military strategists call a Pyrrhic victory, technically successful in imposing costs, but so damaging to the victor that it doesn't feel like victory at all. So, what does all this mean for you, sitting in 2026 watching this unfold? It means the economic certainties we grew up with are dissolving. The assumption that the US, the dollar will always be the global reserve currency, that Western financial institutions will always dominate, that economic interdependence prevents major wars, these ideas are being tested and found wanting. We're entering a period of profound uncertainty in the global economic order. It means inflation and economic instability are likely to persist longer than governments want to admit, because the supply chains and energy systems that kept prices stable are being restructured along political rather than economic lines. Efficiency is being sacrificed for security. Globalization is reversing into regionalization. It means the tools that Western nations relied on for influence, sanctions, financial restrictions, access to markets, are becoming less effective with each use. Like antibiotics that create resistant bacteria, economic weapons are generating resistant economic systems, and it means the risk of miscalculation in future conflicts has increased dramatically because leaders on all sides now have recent proof that economic pressure doesn't necessarily translate to political compliance. But here's what you can do with this knowledge. First, understand that we're living through a historic transition. The post-1945 economic order is giving way to something new, and transitions are always turbulent. Your financial planning should account for continued volatility in energy prices, food prices, and currency values. Second, diversification matters more than ever, not just in your investments, but in your skills, your knowledge, and your adaptability. The workers and businesses that thrive in the coming decades will be those that can operate across multiple systems and navigate complexity. Third, push for better leadership and smarter policy. The sanctions on Russia failed not because economic pressure can never work, but because they were designed based on outdated assumptions and wishful thinking rather than rigorous analysis. Demand that your elected officials learn these lessons rather than repeat the same mistakes. Fourth, resist simplistic narratives. The story of Russia's economic resilience isn't a vindication of Putin or his invasion. It's a complex tale about the limits of economic coercion, the adaptability of modern economies, and the unintended consequences of wielding financial power too bluntly. And finally, I recognize that you're more connected to these global forces than you might think. The price you pay for gas, for food, for manufactured goods, these are determined by the same supply chains, currency systems, and geopolitical tensions we've been discussing. Understanding these forces gives you power to make better decisions. Let me bring this full circle. Remember that moment in February 2022 when Western leaders promised swift economic devastation. They meant well. They believed deeply in the power of their economic tools, but they had confused the map for the territory, the theory for the reality. The world economy had already changed in ways they hadn't fully grasped. Power had already diffused more than they realized. And their own weapon, the threat of exclusion from dollar-based systems, had already begun to lose its edge through overuse. Russia's economy didn't collapse because it had prepared, because alternatives existed, and because a significant portion of the world chose not to participate in the sanctions regime. The backfire happened because the costs of these sanctions were distributed globally, while the benefits were questionable and the precedents set were dangerous. This isn't cause for despair, it's cause for clearer thinking. The challenges we face, from authoritarian aggression to climate change to economic inequality, require international cooperation. But cooperation can't be built on coercion alone. It requires genuine partnership, mutual respect, and institutions that serve broad interests rather than narrow ones. The sanctions on Russia were sold as a demonstration of Western unity and strength. In many ways, they revealed fragmentation and limitations instead. That's uncomfortable. It challenges narratives we find reassuring. But facing reality is always better than clinging to comfortable illusions. The global economy is being rebuilt right now, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question isn't whether change is coming. It's already here. The question is whether we'll understand it clearly enough to shape it wisely, or whether we'll keep operating on autopilot with strategies designed for a world that no longer exists. You now know what many prefer to ignore. The economic warfare everyone promised would end this conflict quickly has instead accelerated the transition to a more fragmented, less stable global order. Russia survived through adaptation and alternative partnerships. The West imposed real costs but paid significant prices itself, and the developing world watched carefully, drawing lessons that will shape economic and political alignments for decades. This knowledge gives you something valuable, the ability to see past the narratives, to understand the deeper forces reshaping our world. Use it wisely, share it broadly, and demand better from those who make decisions in your name. Because the next time someone promises that sanctions will swiftly topple an adversary, you'll know to ask harder questions.